Well, my friend, are you ready to plunge into a murky epoch where truth and fiction are so tightly interwoven that the devil himself couldn't untangle them? Hold on tight, because we're heading straight to the very beginnings, to the time when the site of the future eternal city was inhabited only by wolves, and the wind blew tumbleweeds across the 7 hills. And it all begins, as is customary for stories aspiring to greatness, with blood, betrayal, and the desperate cry of infants abandoned to certain death. Picture this scene. The muddy, cold waters of the Tiber, carrying 2 tiny bodies in a fragile basket. Their grandfather, King Numitor, had been overthrown by his own brother, the wicked Romulus. And to make his throne absolutely secure, Romulus ordered the heirs drowned, the sons of Rhea Silvia, Numitor's daughter, whom he had foresightedly made a Vestal virgin, a priestess bound to perpetual chastity. But, as you understand, the gods, or chance if you're a skeptic, had other plans for these boys. Perhaps Mars, the god of war, couldn't resist Rhea's beauty and fathered the twins. Or perhaps it's just a beautiful legend to justify their future warlike nature. It's impossible to know now. The fact is, the basket with the infants was washed ashore at the foot of the Palatine Hill, right where the sacred fig tree of Romulus stood. And this is where the part of the story begins that even school children know. The she-wolf. Not just any she-wolf, but a Lupa, as the Romans called her, who, instead of devouring the helpless crying creatures, suddenly felt a surge of maternal instincts. She suckled them with her milk, warmed them with her body. Just imagine, a wild beast, a predator, and 2 human babies sucking at her teats, a scene worthy of Rubens' brush, no doubt. And it wasn't just the she-wolf who helped save them. They say a woodpecker and a lapwing also fed the little ones, bringing them berries and insects. It's like a Disney cartoon, if it weren't for the harsh reality of the ancient world. But this couldn't go on forever. Sooner or later, someone was bound to find the boys. And that someone was the king's shepherd, Faustulus. He was going about his business, maybe looking for his flock, or maybe just enjoying the morning coolness, when he suddenly heard strange sounds, not quite weeping, not quite whimpering. He came closer and froze in astonishment. A she-wolf was licking 2 infants. Faustulus, a simple man, but not devoid of compassion, or perhaps just realizing that these children weren't ordinary, given that a she-wolf was feeding them, took them home. His wife, Acca Larentia, was either a woman with a kind heart, or, according to another, less flattering version, was herself a woman of loose morals, which earned her the nickname she-wolf, Lupa. In Latin, this word also had a figurative meaning, referring to a prostitute, but one way or another, she accepted the boys as her own. They were given the names Romulus and Remus. Thus, under the care of the shepherd and his wife, far from palace intrigues, but in the very heart of the future world power, the future founders of Rome grew up. They didn't know of their royal lineage, but the blood spoke for itself. The boys grew up strong, brave, and daring. They feared neither wild beasts nor the bandits who often roamed the surrounding lands in those days. Romulus was more thoughtful and inclined towards leadership. Remus was more impetuous and hot-headed, but together they were a formidable force. They gathered around them equally daring young men from among the shepherds and brave youths, raided bandit gangs, shared the spoils, and established their own order. Essentially, it was a kind of primitive gang, but with the beginnings of justice and organization. They protected the flocks from predators and the local inhabitants from robbers. The fame of their exploits gradually spread throughout the area. No one suspected that these courageous shepherds were the grandsons of the deposed king of Alba Longa, an ancient city founded, according to legend, by Aeneas's son, Ascanius Iulus. Alba Longa was considered the mother city for many Latin settlements, and its fate was closely tied to the future of Rome. And now, as often happens in good stories, chance intervened, or, if you prefer, providence. During one of the skirmishes with the shepherds of King Amulius, who were grazing livestock on neighboring lands, Remus was captured. He was accused of robbery and brought for judgment before Numitor himself, the deposed grandfather, who lived in exile but still wielded some influence. Numitor, seeing the young man, was struck by his noble bearing and the courage with which he conducted himself. Something subtly familiar seemed to him in Remus's features. And just then, Faustulus, learning of the capture of one of his adopted sons and fearing for his life, finally decided to reveal the secret of their origin to Romulus. He told him everything he knew about Rhea Silvia, about the cruel Amulius, about the basket, and about the she-wolf. Romulus, hearing this, knew the time had come. He gathered his loyal companions, armed them with whatever they could find, and marched on Alba Longa to free his brother and avenge his grandfather. Can you imagine the scene? Yesterday's shepherds, armed with clubs and hunting knives, marching to overthrow a usurper. It's pure Hollywood, just without the special effects. But strength of spirit and a thirst for justice work miracles. Romulus and his band burst into the city, raised a rebellion, and Remus, whom Numitor was already beginning to suspect his true identity, was also not idle. In short, Amulius was overthrown and killed, and Numitor was restored to the throne of Alba Longa. Justice triumphed. It seemed like a happy ending. The heroic brothers, saved by a she-wolf, had returned the throne to their grandfather. Live and be happy. But it wasn't that simple. Romulus and Remus, having tasted freedom and power, could no longer simply return to a shepherd's life, and Alba Longa felt too small for them. They were used to being first, and here, a king grandfather, his own rules. And then a bold idea was born in their minds. Why not found their own city? There, where the she-wolf found them, on those very hills by the Tiber. The location was strategically advantageous. The river provided water and a transportation route, and the hills offered natural defense. Said and done. They gathered their supporters, equally young and ambitious, and set off in search of the ideal location for the new city. And this is where, between the brothers, who had always been so close, the first black cat crossed their path. They couldn't agree on which hill to build the city. Romulus chose the Palatine, the very one at the foot of which the she-wolf had found them. Remus, however, insisted on the Aventine. The dispute grew ever fiercer. To resolve it, they decided to resort to auspices, divination by the flight of birds, an ancient and respected way to learn the will of the gods. Remus was the first to see 6 vultures. He was already celebrating victory when suddenly 12 appeared to Romulus. Victory was Romulus's. The Palatine. This is where the city would be. But Remus couldn't accept defeat. He was enraged, insulted. When Romulus began digging the sacred furrow with a plow, marking the boundaries of the future city, according to tradition, the plow was pulled by a white cow and a white bull. Remus mockingly jumped over it and over the freshly raised earthen wall. "This is how easily enemies will take your city," he shouted. This wasn't just a boyish prank. It was sacrilege, an insult to a sacred ritual. Romulus, in a fury at such blasphemy, or, according to another version, it was done by one of his followers, a certain sealer, struck Remus. the blow was fatal. Brother killed brother at the very beginning of the city that was meant to become a symbol of law and order. A grim start, isn't it? Remus's blood was the first sacrifice offered on the altar of Rome's future greatness. Romulus, they say, wept bitterly for his brother, but the deed was done. The city was founded, and it received the name of its founder, Roma. This happened, according to Varro's legendary dating, on April 21st, 753 BC. This date is still celebrated as Rome's birthday. But a city is not just walls and houses. A city is people. And Romulus had a problem with people. Who would go live in a newly founded settlement, especially one with such a dark history at its very gates? The first inhabitants of Rome were Romulus's companions, shepherds, runaway slaves, exiles, adventurers from all around. In short, quite a crowd. There were many men, but women were scarce. How to build a future? How to ensure population growth if there are no women? Romulus declared Rome a refuge for all who sought a new life, promising them protection and equal rights. People flocked in, but they were mostly men. And then Romulus devised a cunning, yet rather treacherous plan, which went down in history as the rape of the Sabine women. But that, as they say, is a completely different story, one that deserves a separate telling. Meanwhile, Rome stood, bathed in the blood of one of its founders, ready for new achievements and new tragedies. And the myth of the she-wolf, of divine origin, of fraternal strife, was forever imprinted in the genetic code of this city, defining its stern, warlike, and indomitable character. The beginning was made, and it was, to put it mildly, turbulent. And who could have imagined then that this collection of shepherds and vagabonds on 7 hills would eventually turn into the capital of the world, into an empire that would dictate its will to peoples from Britain to Persia? But that's exactly how it all began, with the crying of infants, the milk of a she-wolf, and fratricidal rage. Rome grew, but it grew somewhat lopsidedly. Men, strong, desperate, ready for anything, but without women, the city was doomed to die out. Romulus, like a true ruler, albeit a newly minted one, understood this better than anyone. He sent envoys to neighboring tribes, primarily to the Sabines, who lived nearby, with requests for marriage alliances. "We're building a new city here," he'd say. "Our people are young and eager. Let's be friends and intermarry." But the neighbors looked down on the Romans. Who were they? A rabble, fugitives, murderers. Marry their daughters to such people? No, thank you. The proud Sabines, like other Italic tribes, refused, sometimes with mocking replies. "Maybe you should open a refuge for women too," they would taunt. "Then perhaps you'll find suitable matches." This, of course, angered Romulus. His pride was wounded, and the future of his creation was threatened. And then a plan ripened in his mind, audacious and cruel, but, as he saw it, the only possible one. He announced grand festivities in honor of the god Consus, the patron of harvest and secret councils. According to another version, these were games in honor of Neptune Equester. Invitations were sent to all neighbors. The Romans promised unprecedented spectacles, horse races, contests. The neighbors, fond of entertainment and simply out of curiosity, came in large numbers. There were especially many Sabines who came with their whole families, wives and daughters included. They had no idea what trap awaited them. The festival was in full swing. Wine flowed like a river, music blared, the crowd was merry. Romulus gave a prearranged signal. According to one version, he raised his cloak. And then it began. The Roman youths, instructed beforehand and likely heated by wine and anticipation, rushed upon the unarmed guests and began seizing the maidens. Screams, tears, pandemonium. Fathers and brothers tried to defend their women, but the Romans were prepared for resistance. They pushed the men aside and dragged the young women into their homes. This was not just abduction, it was outright violence, treachery, a violation of all laws of hospitality. Legend says that several hundred maidens were abducted, mostly Sabines, but also from other tribes. It is also said that Romulus supposedly ordered his men not to touch married women, but only to take virgins, and that he even personally pointed out a particularly beautiful maiden named Silvia, whom he later married. But this is most likely later attempts to somehow sanitize this ugly episode. The fact remains, Rome obtained its women by force. The Sabines and other offended tribes were furious. They returned home, seething with anger and a thirst for revenge. War was inevitable. The first to march on Rome were the inhabitants of the Latin cities of Senina, Cristumium, and Antemne, whose daughters had also been abducted. Romulus defeated them one by one. The king of Senina, Acron, he killed in single combat and stripped him of his armor, which he then dedicated to Jupiter Feretrius, thus founding the tradition of spolia opima, the dedication of the armor of an enemy chieftain killed in battle by a Roman commander. This further strengthened his authority and military glory. But the Sabines were a more serious opponent. They assembled a large army under the command of King Titus Tatius and marched on Rome. The war was long and bloody. The Sabines besieged the Capitoline Hill, one of the key Roman strongholds. And here, another legend is woven into the story about the betrayal of Tarpeia. She was the daughter of the commander of the Capitoline Guard. The Sabines bribed her, promising what they wore on their left arms, meaning their gold bracelets and rings. Tarpeia opened the gates to them, but the Sabines, despising the traitress, fulfilled their promise literally. They threw their heavy shields, which they also carried on their left arms, upon her. Tarpeia perished under their weight, and the rock from which criminals were later thrown in Rome was named after her, the Tarpeian Rock. The Sabines captured the Capitoline. The decisive battle took place in the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, where the Roman Forum would later arise. The battle was fierce. The forces were roughly equal. The Romans faltered and began to retreat. Romulus himself was wounded in the head by a stone. Defeat seemed imminent. And then Romulus appealed to Jupiter Stator, the Stayer, promising to build him a temple if the god would stop the flight of his warriors. Whether the prayer helped or the Romans, ashamed of their weakness, regained their spirits, they stopped and rushed back into the fight. And at this very critical moment, when the outcome of the battle hung in the balance, something incredible happened. The women, the very Sabine women who had been abducted, ran out onto the battlefield. With disheveled hair, in torn clothes, they threw themselves between the combatants, begging them to stop. On one side were their fathers and brothers, on the other, their husbands, the fathers of their children. Many had already given birth by then. "If you so hate this alliance," they cried, "then turn your wrath upon us. We are the cause of this war. It is better for us to perish than to live as widows or orphans." It was a scene full of tragedy and despair, and it worked. The warriors laid down their arms. Silence, broken only by the women's sobs, hung over the battlefield. The leaders, Romulus and Titus Tatius, came forward. They were shaken by the women's courage and selflessness. It became clear that continuing the war was pointless. Peace was concluded. But not just peace, something more. Romans and Sabines decided to unite into one people. Titus Tatius became Romulus's co-ruler. The Sabines moved to Rome, and their nobility was included in the Roman Senate. Two peoples, who had been mortal enemies just yesterday, merged into one. This was a turning point in early Roman history. The city not only gained the women it so desperately needed and secured its future, but it also doubled its population and military strength. It demonstrated an astonishing ability to absorb and integrate foreigners, turning them into its own citizens. This trait would become one of the key reasons for future Roman success. The joint rule of Romulus and Titus Tatius lasted for several years. They are said to have ruled in harmony, though of course there were bound to be tensions. But soon, Titus Tatius was killed in Lavinium during a sacrifice. According to one version, it was vengeance by the inhabitants of Lavinium for some offense. According to another, Romulus himself was involved in intrigues, as he didn't want to share power. Be that as it may, Romulus became the sole ruler once again. He continued to strengthen the city, create laws, and organize the army. He divided all citizens capable of bearing arms into legions. Each legion was accompanied by a detachment of cavalry. He established a senate of 100 fathers, patres, the most respected and noble citizens who were to assist him with advice. He also divided the people into 3 tribes: Ramnes, original Romans; Tetes, Sabines; and Luceres. The origin of this tribe is unclear, perhaps Etruscans or other settlers. Each tribe, in turn, was divided into 10 curiae. The curiae became the basis not only of military organization, but also of political life. Popular assemblies, comitia, were held by curiae. Romulus laid the foundations of the Roman state, its military and civil institutions. He was not only a warrior and conqueror, but also a legislator and organizer. He created the framework upon which all future Roman power would be built. But even such great founders as Romulus have their time. His reign was long and glorious, but his end is shrouded in mystery, which further contributed to his deification. According to one, the most widespread legend, Romulus disappeared during a storm and thunderstorm while reviewing his army on the Campus Martius. A thick cloud enveloped him, and when it cleared, the royal throne was gone, as was Romulus himself. The people were in turmoil. The senators announced that Romulus had been taken to heaven by the gods. Later, he allegedly appeared in a dream to a noble Roman, Julius Proculus, and announced that he had become the god Quirinus and would be Rome's patron if the Romans honored him and upheld military valor. Thus, the myth of Romulus concluded with his apotheosis, his transformation into a deity. This was very important for the Romans. Their founder did not just die but ascended to heaven, becoming one of the principal gods. This gave Rome a special sacred status. Of course, there was another, less pious version. It was whispered that the senators, dissatisfied with Romulus's ever-increasing power and severity, simply killed him during a Senate meeting, and then secretly carried his body out piece by piece under their togas. And the story of the storm and ascension was invented to appease the people. It's hard to say where the truth lies, but for Roman identity, the myth of Quirinus was far more important than the prosaic truth of political murder. Thus ended the era of Romulus, the first king of Rome. He founded the city, gave it its name, its first inhabitants, its first laws, its first army. He was the son of Mars, suckled by a she-wolf, a fratricide, an abductor of women, a wise legislator, and a deified hero. His figure will forever remain a symbol of Rome, a city born in violence, but aspiring to greatness. And so, after the mysterious disappearance of Romulus, a period of interregnum followed. The senators could not immediately agree on a new ruler. Power passed from one interrex, a temporary ruler from among the senators, to another every 5 days. This continued for about a year. The people began to grumble, demanding the election of a new king. After the turbulent and warlike reign of Romulus, which left behind a city cemented by blood and ambition, but still rough and untamed, the Romans seemed to grow weary of perpetual wars and upheavals. They needed peace, order, something that could unite the motley population, not only by force of arms, but also by common values and beliefs. And this is where a completely different character enters the scene, the polar opposite of Romulus, Numa Pompilius. If Romulus was the son of Mars, the embodiment of war and action, Numa was a man of peace, wisdom, and piety. Legend says he was a Sabine from the city of Cures, renowned for his justice and profound knowledge of divine and human laws. When the Roman Senate and people, after long debates and a period of interregnum, decided to offer him the kingship, Numa initially refused. He was already elderly, preferred a secluded life dedicated to contemplation and service to the gods. He was repelled by the hustle and cruelty of political life. But the persistent requests of the Romans, and according to some versions, a divine sign, convinced him to accept this heavy burden. And Numa Pompilius became the second king of Rome. His reign, which according to tradition lasted 43 years, approximately from 715 to 673-672 BC, became a golden age of peace and prosperity for the young city. The first thing Numa did was close the gates of the temple of Janus. This temple had a unique feature. Its gates were open in times of war and closed in times of peace. During Romulus's entire reign, they had never been closed. Numa, having made peace with all his neighbors, solemnly locked them, symbolizing the advent of an era of tranquility. Numa's main concern was the religious organization of Rome. He understood that without a strong spiritual foundation, the city could not endure. He regulated the cults of existing gods and introduced the worship of new ones. Numa is credited with establishing the priestly colleges, which played an enormous role in Roman life for centuries. He appointed a chief priest, the Pontifex Maximus, who was to oversee the proper performance of all religious rites. The pontiffs also managed the calendar, determined festival and working days, and interpreted laws. Numa established the College of Flamines, priests of individual gods, Jupiter, Flamen Dialis, Mars, Flamen Martialis, and Quirinus, Flamen Quirinalis, as well as 12 lesser flamens. The service of the Flamen Dialis was particularly complex, surrounded by numerous prohibitions and restrictions, emphasizing its special sanctity. He created the College of Salii, dancing priests, priests of Mars, who in March and October carried sacred shields, ancelae, through the city with songs and ritual dances. One of these shields, according to legend, fell from the sky during Numa's time as a pledge of Rome's invincibility. To prevent its theft, Numa ordered 11 exact copies made. Only the Salii knew which shield was the original. Numa also established the College of Fetiales, priest diplomats responsible for declaring war and making peace. Before starting a war, the Fetiales had to perform complex rituals, demand satisfaction from the enemy, and only if they refused was the war considered just, bellum justum. This gave Roman wars a sacred character. Numa paid special attention to the cult of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. He built her a round temple in the forum, where a sacred fire constantly burned, symbolizing the life of the city. This fire was to be maintained by the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of Vesta, chosen from noble families and bound to perpetual chastity for 30 years of service. Violation of the vow was punished by a terrible execution. The offending Vestal was buried alive. Numa reformed the calendar. Before him, the Romans used a lunar calendar, which was very inaccurate. Numa attempted to reconcile it with the solar year, adding missing days and introducing intercalary months. He divided the year into 12 months, giving some of them new names, for example, January in honor of Janus, February from the word februa, purification rites. He also defined pure, dies fasti, and impure, dies nefasti, days when public business and judicial proceedings could be conducted, and days when they were forbidden. Numa is considered to have introduced the worship of Terminus, the god of boundaries, in Rome. Annually, a festival called the Terminalia was held in his honor, during which boundary stones were consecrated. This was important for establishing order and preventing land disputes. But the most mysterious and romantic part of the legend about Numa is his connection with the nymph Egeria. It is said that Numa often withdrew to a sacred grove where he met with Egeria, who was his lover and divine mentor. It was she who revealed to him the will of the gods, taught him wisdom, and helped him create laws. These meetings gave Numa's laws divine authority. Numa also divided Roman lands among the citizens, encouraging agriculture. He established craft guilds, collegia opificum, uniting artisans by profession. This fostered the development of crafts and trade, although Numa's Rome still remained predominantly agrarian. Unlike Romulus, who ruled by force and the authority of a chieftain, Numa governed with gentleness, wisdom, and piety. He kept no bodyguards. His palace was open to all. He taught the Romans not only how to fight, but also how to live in peace, respect the gods, obey the laws, and work their land. Under him, Rome transformed from a den of bandits into a well-ordered and God-fearing state. After a long and peaceful reign, Numa Pompilius died a natural death, mourned by all the people. He was buried with great honors on the Janiculum Hill. It is said that books containing his laws and religious regulations were also buried near his tomb. Later, many centuries later, these books were allegedly found, but the Senate deemed their content too dangerous for the minds of the common people, or too contradictory to changed customs, and ordered them burned. Thus ended the era of Numa, leaving behind a solid foundation of Roman religion and law. He showed that a state could be built not only on swords, but also on altars. His legacy was no less important for the future of Rome than that of Romulus. If Romulus created the body of Rome, Numa breathed a soul into it. Of course, historians dispute how real the figure of Numa and all the deeds attributed to him are. Many consider him a legendary character, a composite figure embodying the period of formation of Roman religious institutions. Perhaps the reforms attributed to Numa were in reality the result of a long process that spanned decades or even centuries. But for the Romans themselves, Numa was absolutely real. He was the ideal peace king, the antipode to the warlike Romulus. These two images, Romulus and Numa, symbolized, as it were, two sides of the Roman character: warlikeness and piety, the drive for conquest and respect for law and tradition. After Numa's death, a brief interregnum occurred again, and then the Romans elected a new third king. And this choice again sharply contrasted with the previous ruler, as if Rome were constantly seeking a balance between war and peace, swinging from one extreme to another. and next in line was a man who seemed determined to make up for everything lost during Numa's peaceful years. After the long and tranquil reign of Numa Pompilius, when temples were built more often than city walls, and the ringing of priestly bells drowned out the clash of weapons, the Romans seemed to grow bored once more with the glory of military exploits. Peace is, of course, good, but the soul craved something more exciting. And so, as if in response to this unspoken desire, Tullus Hostilius ascended the Roman throne, the third king of Rome, whose very name sounded like a challenge. He was the grandson of Hostius Hostilius, one of Romulus's bravest comrades, who fell in battle against the Sabines. So warlike blood flowed in his veins, and he had no intention of diluting it with peace treaties and religious ceremonies. The reign of Tullus Hostilius, approximately 672-640 BC, was the complete opposite of Numa's era. If Numa closed the gates of the Temple of Janus, Tullus threw them wide open and, it seems, lost the key. Wars became his primary occupation, his passion, his raison d'etre. Hardly had he ascended the throne than Tullus Hostilius began looking for a pretext for war, and a pretext, as is usual, was found fairly quickly. Mutual raids and cattle rustling began between the Romans and the inhabitants of Alba Longa. That same Alba Longa, the ancient Latin city that was considered Rome's mother city, its metropolis. Remember, Romulus and Remus were the grandsons of Alba Longa's king Numitor. It seemed like two related peoples, a shared history, common gods. But for Tullus Hostilius, these were just sentiments. He craved to assert Rome's superiority, and Alba Longa, with its ancient glory, was the ideal rival for this purpose. Diplomatic negotiations, if they happened at all, quickly reached a deadlock. Both sides accused each other, and war became inevitable. The armies of Rome and Alba Longa met on the battlefield. But before the battle began, when the warriors already stood facing each other, ready to rush into mortal combat, something happened that became one of the most famous legends of Roman history. The commanders of both armies, the Roman king Tullus Hostilius and the Alban dictator Metius Fufidius, decided to avoid bloodshed and determine the outcome of the war by single combat. But not their own, but a combat between chosen warriors. And so it happened that in both armies there were triplet brothers, equal in strength and age. On the Roman side were the Hieraci brothers. On the Alban side, the Curiati brothers. They were the ones who were to fight for the fate of their cities. 3 Hieraci against 3 Curiati. Imagine the tension. 2 armies froze in anticipation. Everything was at stake. The combat began. It was fierce and brutal. Soon 2 of the Hieraci fell dead. The surviving 3rd Horatius found himself alone against 3 Curiati. However, all 3 Albans were wounded, though to varying degrees. It seemed that Rome's fate was sealed. The Albans were already celebrating victory, but the remaining Horatius did not lose heart. He employed a military stratagem. Feigning flight, he provoked the Curiatii to pursue him. Since they were wounded differently, they ran at different speeds, stretching out across the field. Horatius, waiting until the first of the Curiati drew near him, suddenly turned and struck him down. Then he dealt with the second, and then with the third, who was most severely wounded and could barely hobble. Victory! Rome had won. At the cost of 2 brothers' lives, but it had won. Alba Longa, according to the agreement, was to submit to Rome. Metius Fufidius acknowledged defeat and led his army away. The victorious Horatius, having stripped the slain Curiati of their armor, returned to Rome in triumph. At the city gates, he was met by his sister, Camilla. She was engaged to one of the curiati, and seeing her fiancé's cloak, which she herself had woven for him, on her brother's shoulder, she burst into tears and curses against her brother the killer and all of Rome, which was rejoicing in this victory. Horatius, enraged by her words, which he considered betrayal and an insult to his valor and Rome's glory, drew his sword and ran his sister through, exclaiming, "Go join your betrothed with your untimely love. So perish every Roman woman who dares mourn an enemy." It was a shock. The hero who had just saved Rome committed a terrible crime, the murder of his own sister. His action caused indignation. Horatius was brought to trial for murder. He faced the death penalty. But his father, old Publius Horatius, spoke in defense of his son. He reminded them of his son's heroic deed, of the fact that he had lost 2 sons, and begged the people not to take his last one. He pointed to the curiati's armor, displayed as trophies, and asked if the Romans really wanted to see their savior, crowned with glory, shackled, and executed. The people, moved by the father's tears and remembering Horatius's services, acquitted him. However, to atone for the spilled blood, Horatius had to pass under the sister's yoke, tigillum sororium, a kind of symbolic arch, and offer purification sacrifices. This episode with the Horatii and Curiati, as well as the tragic fate of Camilla, deeply imprinted themselves on the Roman consciousness. It spoke of harsh patriotism, of the interests of the state being above personal feelings, of a readiness for sacrifice in the name of Rome. But let's return to Alba Longa. Metius Fufetius, although he submitted to Rome, harbored resentment. He waited for an opportune moment to take revenge. And such a moment presented itself when Rome became embroiled in a war with the cities of Fidenae and Veii, an Etruscan city. Tullus Hostilius called upon the Albans for assistance as his allies. Metius Fufetius brought his army, but at the decisive moment of the battle, he did not engage, instead withdrawing his troops to a nearby hill, waiting to see who would prevail. He hoped that the Romans would be defeated, and then he could easily deal with them. But Tullus Hostilius did not lose his composure. He proved himself not only a brave warrior, but also a cunning commander. He shouted loudly to his soldiers that Metius was acting on his orders to outflank the enemy from the rear. This encouraged the Romans and sowed confusion in the enemy ranks. The Romans won the victory. After the battle, Tullus Hostilius severely punished Metius Fufetius for treason. He was tied to 2 chariots that were driven in opposite directions and torn apart. A cruel execution, but, in the opinion of the Romans, a just one. And then Tullus Hostilius made an even more radical decision. He ordered Alba Longa destroyed to its foundations. All the inhabitants of Alba were relocated to Rome, to the Caelian Hill. They were granted Roman citizenship, and the noble Alban families, such as the Julii, from whom Julius Caesar would later descend, were incorporated into the Roman Senate and the Patriciate. The temples of Alba Longa were spared, but the city itself ceased to exist. This was a bold and cruel step. On the one hand, Rome eliminated a dangerous rival and significantly increased its population and territory. On the other hand, it destroyed its mother metropolis, the city with which it shared ancient ties. But for Tullus Hostilius, pragmatism and the interests of Rome were paramount. He wanted Rome to be the sole center of power in Latium, and he achieved it. Besides the wars with Alba Longa, Fidenae, and Veii, Tullus Hostilius waged other wars, constantly expanding Roman influence. He built a new building for the Senate, the Curia Hostilia, which stood for several centuries. He also paid attention to military organization, strengthening the army and discipline. But his warlikeness and disregard for religion, as legend has it, eventually brought upon him the wrath of the gods. A plague broke out in Rome. Tullus Hostilius himself also fell ill. They say that he, trying to appease the gods, began consulting the records of Numa Pompilius and attempted to perform secret rites in honor of Jupiter Elicius, the bringer forth of lightning. But either he performed them incorrectly, or the gods no longer wanted to listen to him. But during one of these rites, lightning struck his palace, and Tullus Hostilius burned alive along with his entire house. Thus ended the reign of the third Roman king, the warlike and ruthless Tullus Hostilius. He significantly expanded Rome's territory and power, but his methods were harsh and his end was tragic. He showed that Rome could be not only pious, as under Numa, but also aggressive, ready to destroy anyone who stood in its way. Once again, an interregnum occurred. The Romans, frightened by the wrath of the gods and tired of endless wars, again desired peace and order. They sought a ruler who could combine the valor of Romulus, the piety of Numa, and the organizational skills of Tullus Hostilius, but without their extremes. And the choice fell upon Ancus Marcius. After the fiery death of Tullus Hostilius, which many saw as divine punishment for his godless belligerence, the Romans found themselves at a crossroads again. The period of interregnum, though brief, was always a time of some uncertainty. Whom to elect? What path would Rome take next? Would it plunge into the abyss of wars again, or return to peaceful construction? It seems the lessons of the previous reigns were not lost. The Romans needed a leader capable of finding the golden mean, a balance between Mars and Jupiter, between sword and plow, between expanding borders and strengthening internal order. And that man was Ancus Marcius, the fourth king of Rome, who ruled approximately from 640 to 616 BC. Interestingly, Ancus Marcius was the grandson of Numa Pompilius on his mother's side. This kinship with the pious peace king immediately endeared him to the people, who were tired of Tullus Hostilius's endless wars. Ancus Marcius himself was by nature inclined towards peace and justice, like his grandfather. However, he perfectly understood that Rome was surrounded by unfriendly neighbors, and that without a strong army and a willingness to defend its interests, the city would not survive. Therefore, his reign became an attempt to harmoniously combine the policies of Numa and Romulus. The first thing Ancus Marcius did was order the pontiffs to publicly display Numa's religious regulations so that the people would not forget piety and the proper performance of rites. He restored many religious practices that had been forgotten or neglected under Tullus Hostilius. By doing this, he signaled a return to his grandfather's traditions. But the neighbors, especially the Latins, seeing in Ancus Marcius merely a continuation of Numa's peaceful policy, decided that it was time to challenge Rome and regain their lost positions. They began raiding Roman lands, believing that the new king would not dare to go to war. They were mistaken. Ancus Marcius, before initiating military action, strictly followed the procedures established by Numa for the fetiales. He sent envoys, demanded compensation for damages, and only after the Latins' refusal did he declare war, observing all the rituals. By this, he showed that war for Rome was not a king's whim, but a necessary and just measure. And Ancus Marcius fought successfully. He defeated the Latins in several battles, captured and destroyed a number of their cities, such as Politorium, Telene, Ficana. Following the example of Tullus Hostilius, he resettled the inhabitants of these cities in Rome, but not on the Caelian hill, but on the Aventine. The Aventine, therefore, came to be settled primarily by plebeians, while the Palatine and Caelian were strongholds of the patricians. This division would play a role in the class struggle in the future. The most important achievement of Ancus Marcius was the founding of the first Roman colony, Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber. This was a strategically important step. Ostia became Rome's seaport, providing access to the sea, control over trade and salt production. Salt works at the Tiber mouth were of enormous economic importance. The founding of Ostia also protected Rome from attacks by sea. Legend attributes to Ancus Marcius the construction of the first bridge over the Tiber, a wooden bridge on piles, the Ponce Sublicius. This bridge connected Rome with the Janiculum Hill on the right bank of the Tiber, which Ancus Marcius also fortified, turning it into a kind of outpost. The Janiculum was important for defending the city from the Etruscans, who lived north of the Tiber and posed a constant threat. To supply the city with water, Ancus Marcius is said to have built the first aqueduct, the Aqua Marcia, although most historians place its construction much later, 2nd century BC. Perhaps it refers to some earlier and simpler water supply structures. Ancus Marcius also built the first prison in Rome, the Mamertine prison, Carcer Mamertinus, at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. This indicates the growth of the city and the increasing complexity of social relations when special places were needed for holding criminals. In general, Ancus Marcius's reign was a period of active construction and expansion. Under him, Rome not only fought wars, but also developed economically, strengthening its infrastructure. Ancus Marcius proved to be a wise and far-sighted ruler who understood that the strength of the state lay not only in the army, but also in the well-being of its citizens, in the development of trade and crafts. He skillfully combined military valor with concern for peace and order. He was neither a bloodthirsty conqueror, like Romulus or Tullus Hostilius, nor a detached sage, like Numa. He was a pragmatist who acted in the interests of Rome as he understood them, and in this, he perhaps laid another important trait of the Roman character, the ability to adapt to circumstances, to be flexible, yet persistent in achieving goals. Under Ancus Marcius, settlers from other lands also began arriving in Rome, attracted by the city's growing power and opportunities. And one such settler was a certain Lucumo, a rich and ambitious Etruscan from the city of Tarquinia. His appearance in Rome marked the beginning of a new era in the city's history, the era of Etruscan influence, which would bring to power the so-called Tarquin dynasty. But this would be after Ancus Marcius's death. Ancus Marcius, like his grandfather Numa, died a natural death, leaving behind a strong and prosperous state. He ruled, according to tradition, for 24 years, and his reign is considered one of the most successful in the regal period. He strengthened Rome both internally and externally, expanded its territory, provided access to the sea, and integrated new population groups. He showed that one could be a warrior, a builder, and a legislator simultaneously. He seemed to synthesize the experience of his predecessors, taking the best from each. After his death, Ancus Marcius's sons were still too young to claim the throne. And this is where that same Lucumo, who by then had already gained the respect and trust of the Romans, changed his Etruscan name to the Latin Lucius Tarquinius, and even became the guardian of the deceased king's sons, stepped to the forefront. A new Etruscan chapter in the history of Rome was beginning, and this chapter would be filled with both great achievements and dark events that would ultimately lead to the fall of royal power and the birth of the Republic. But for now, Rome, nurtured by 4 kings, a Latin, a Sabine, another Latin, and another Latin with Sabine roots, stood on the verge of significant changes. The city was maturing, gaining strength, absorbing various cultures and traditions, preparing for its great but difficult destiny. And the legacy of Ancus Marcius, the king-builder and skilled politician, played no small role in this. He left Rome stronger, more organized, and more ready for the challenges of the future than it had ever been before. The death of Ancus Marcius opened the way to power for a completely new type of figure for Rome, not a native Roman, not a Latin, and not a Sabine by birth, but an Etruscan. This man, known in history as Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the Elder, the fifth king of Rome, marked the beginning of the so-called Etruscan dynasty on the Roman throne. His ascent was the result not only of personal ambition and abilities, but also of the growing influence of the powerful Etruscan civilization on young Rome. The legend of his arrival in Rome is quite colorful. Originally named Lucumo, he was the son of a Greek man named Demaratus from Corinth, who fled his native city and settled in the Etruscan city of Tarquinia. There Demaratus married a noble Etruscan woman, and Lucumo inherited a significant fortune from his father. However, being a foreigner by origin, he could not expect a high position in Tarquinia, where the nobility jealously guarded their privileges. His ambitious wife, Tanquil, who, according to tradition, was skilled in interpreting omens, advised him to move to Rome. She saw Rome as a young, dynamically developing city where a talented and wealthy man could achieve more. And so Lucumo, with his wife and retinue, set off for Rome. As their chariot approached the Janiculum Hill, the famous omen occurred. An eagle flew down from the sky, removed Lucumo's felt cap, Pylos, from his head, circled with it in the air, and then replaced it on his head. Tanquil, as a connoisseur of Etruscan discipline, the science of divination, interpreted this as a sign of future royal greatness. In Rome, Lucumo changed his name to the Latin style, Lucius Tarquinius, in honor of his native city Tarquinia, and thanks to his wealth, generosity, and intelligence, he quickly gained popularity. He became close to King Ancus Marcius, became his confidant, and was even appointed guardian of his sons after the king's death. When Ancus Marcius died, Tarquinius, using his influence and the fact that Ancus's sons were still minors, managed to convince the popular assembly to elect him king. He delivered a skillful speech praising his services to Rome and promising to rule wisely and justly. Thus, an Etruscan first ascended the Roman throne, approximately in 616 BC. The reign of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, which according to tradition lasted 38 years until 578 BC, was marked by significant successes both in foreign policy and in the internal organization of Rome. He proved to be an energetic and active ruler. In foreign policy, Tarquinius the Elder waged successful wars with his neighbors, the Latins, Sabines, and Etruscans. He brought a number of Latin cities under Roman control, expanding Roman territory and strengthening Rome's hegemony in Latium. He also achieved significant success in wars against the Etruscans, although he could not completely subjugate them to Rome. Tarquinius Priscus is credited with introducing many Etruscan customs and symbols of authority in Rome. For example, the triumph, the solemn entry of a victorious general into the city in a chariot drawn by 4 white horses, wearing a purple gold-embroidered toga and a laurel wreath on his head. Also of Etruscan origin were the curule chair, a folding chair of ivory used by high magistrates, the lictors with fasces, bundles of rods with an axe embedded, symbols of the right to punish and execute, and the toga praetexta, a white toga with a purple border worn by high officials and boys until adulthood. All these attributes of power emphasize the grandeur and authority of the king, but perhaps the main achievement of Tarquinius Priscus was large-scale construction in Rome. Under him, the city began to acquire the characteristics of a real urban center, not just a cluster of huts on hills. He laid the foundation for the Capitoline Temple, dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the Capitoline Triad. This temple was to become the principal sanctuary of Rome, a symbol of its power and the favor of the gods. Construction was begun by him, but completed by his successors. Tarquinius Priscus built the Circus Maximus, a huge hippodrome in the valley between the Palatine and Aventine, intended for chariot races and other spectacles. This place became one of the main centers of Roman public life for many centuries. He also began draining the marshy low ground between the Palatine and Capitoline, where the Roman Forum would later be located. For this purpose, the Cloaca Maxima, Great Sewer, was built, a huge covered channel that drained wastewater and dried the land. This was a monumental engineering feat for its time, testifying to the high level of Etruscan technology. The Cloaca Maxima functioned throughout Rome's history and is even partially used to this day. Tarquinius the Elder also increased the number of senators from 100 to 200, or even 300, according to some versions, including in the Senate his supporters from among the new men, homines novi, including those from Etruscan families. This strengthened his support among the nobility, but also caused discontent among the old patrician families. He also doubled the number of cavalry in the Roman army, creating new centuries called the Younger, posteriores, or second, secundi, Tarquinians. This increased Rome's military strength. In general, the reign of Tarquinius Priscus was a time of flourishing and modernization for Rome. The city grew larger, richer, and more beautiful. Etruscan influence brought with it more developed technologies, grander rituals, and a more refined culture. Rome increasingly transformed from a simple Latin settlement into a major regional center. However, despite all his successes, Tarquinius Priscus made enemies. The sons of Ancus Marcius, whom he had once removed from power, grew up and harbored resentment. They considered themselves the rightful heirs to the throne and could not accept being ruled by a foreigner, however talented. They saw that Tarquinius was popular with the people and that their chances of regaining power legitimately were nil. And so they decided on murder. They sent 2 assassins to the king disguised as shepherds, who supposedly came to the king to resolve a dispute. When Tarquinius came out to them to hear their case, one of them struck him on the head with an axe. The king fell dead. The assassins tried to flee but were seized by the lictors and executed. The sons of Ancus Marcius, learning of the plot's failure and fearing revenge, fled from Rome. The death of Tarquinius Priscus, around 578 BC, could have led to serious turmoil and a power struggle. But here again, the wise and decisive Tanquil, the widow of the murdered king, showed herself. She concealed her husband's death from the people, announcing that he was only severely wounded and that he appointed his son-in-law, or, according to another version, his ward, Servius Tullius, as his temporary successor and regent. Servius Tullius was a person no less remarkable than Tarquinius himself. His origin is shrouded in mystery and legend. According to one version, he was the son of a slave woman, Ocrisia, captured during the taking of the Latin city of Corniculum. One day, while the boy Servius was sleeping, his head suddenly glowed with a flame that did not harm him. Tanquil, seeing this, understood that the boy was destined for a great fate. She forbade anyone to wake him, and when he woke up, the flame disappeared. From then on, Servius was raised in the royal household as if he were a son, received an excellent education, and married Tarquinius's daughter. According to another, more prosaic version, Servius Tullius was an Etruscan named Mastarna, a follower of a certain Caelus Vibena, and arrived in Rome with him. After Caelus's death, he led his contingent and achieved a high position under Tarquinius. Be that as it may, Tanquil, by proclaiming Servius Tullius regent, gave him the opportunity to consolidate his power. When it became clear that Tarquinius Priscus was dead, and the people had grown accustomed to seeing Servius at the head of the state, he was proclaimed the new king. What is noteworthy is that he became king without a formal election by the popular assembly, relying on the support of the Senate and, probably, the army. This was the first instance of its kind in Roman history, and it showed that royal power was becoming increasingly authoritarian. Thus ended the era of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the first Etruscan king of Rome. He was an outstanding ruler who did much for the city, but his violent death and the rise of his successor laid new contradictions that would lead to even greater upheavals in the future. Rome, under Etruscan influence, was changing rapidly, and these changes were irreversible. The accession of Servius Tullius, the sixth king of Rome, was perhaps one of the most unusual in the line of Roman monarchs. He was neither a blood descendant of the previous kings, except for vague rumors of his possible fatherhood by Tarquinius Priscus himself, or even a deity, nor an elected representative of the popular assembly in the traditional sense. His power was established through the cunning of Tanquil and his own abilities, as well as, likely, the support of that part of Roman society connected with the Etruscan elite and reformist circles. The reign of Servius Tullius, approximately 578 to 535 BC, went down in Roman history as an era of crucial reforms that laid the foundations for the future republican system and long determined the social and military organization of the Roman state. He is called the King Reformer, and this is absolutely justified. If Tarquinius Priscus built the city out of stone, Servius Tullius built the state, creating its structure and institutions. One of the most famous and significant reforms of Servius Tullius was the introduction of the census and the division of citizens into classes and centuries based on their property. This was a real revolution in social structure. Before this, the main criterion for belonging to the Roman community and participating in political life was origin, belonging to a particular tribe and curia. Servius, however, placed wealth at the forefront. All Roman citizens capable of bearing arms were divided into 5, according to some versions, 6, classes based on the size of their property, which was assessed in asses, copper coins. The first class included the wealthiest citizens, possessing property of at least 100,000 asses. They were required to provide full heavy armor, helmet, round shield, clipius, later scutum, greaves, breastplate, spear, and sword. From them were formed 80 centuries of infantry, 40 for older men, seniores, for garrison duty, and 40 for younger men, juniores, for field campaigns, and 18 centuries of cavalry, equites. The cavalry were recruited from the most noble and wealthy citizens, including 6 senior centuries that existed before the reform. The second class, property from 75,000 to 100,000 asses, provided 20 centuries, 10 seniors and 10 juniores each. Their armament was the same as the first class, but without a breastplate and with an oblong shield, scutum, instead of a round one. The third class, from 50,000 to 75,000 asses, also provided 20 centuries. They did not have greaves. The fourth class, from 25,000 to 50,000 asses, another 20 centuries. Their armament consisted only of a spear and a javelin. The fifth class, from 11,000 or 12,500 to 25,000 asses, provided 30 centuries, 15 seniors and 15 juniors each. These were lightly armed slingers and javelin throwers. In addition, there were 2 centuries of craftsmen, fabri, assigned to the first class, and 2 centuries of musicians, trumpeters and horn players, assigned to the 4th or 5th class. Citizens whose property was below the minimum set for the 5th class, less than 11,000 asses, were called proletari, those who give the state only offspring, proles, or capit censi, counted by heads, not by property. They formed 1 century and were exempt from military service, except in emergencies. In total, there were thus 193 or 194 centuries. This system was of immense importance. Firstly, it created a new basis for recruiting the army. Now, each citizen served according to their financial means, providing their own armament. This made the Roman army more organized and effective. Secondly, based on the centuriate system, new popular assemblies were created, the centuriate comitia, comitia centuriata. Voting in these comitia took place by centuries, with each century having 1 vote. Since the first class and the cavalry together comprised 98 centuries, 80 plus or 18, i.e., a majority, 98 out of 193, they effectively decided the outcome of any vote if they acted in unison. This ensured the predominant influence of the wealthiest and most noble part of the citizenry. Over time, the centuriate comitia supplanted the old curiate assemblies and became the most important legislative body. They elected high officials, declared war and made peace, passed laws, and decided matters of life and death for citizens. Thus, Servius Tullius's reform, although it gave formal rights to all citizens, in practice strengthened the power of the propertied class. But, on the other hand, it opened access to political life and military service for those who did not belong to the old hereditary aristocracy but possessed sufficient wealth, for example, wealthy plebeians. This was important for the consolidation of Roman society. Servius Tullius is also credited with expanding the urban territory of Rome. He supposedly included the Quirinal, Viminal, and Esquiline hills within the city limits, bringing the number of hills included in the city to 7, although the exact list of 7 hills could change in different eras. He divided the city into 4 urban tribes: Palatine, Suburban, Esquiline, and Colline, and possibly also created rural tribes for citizens living outside the city limits. This division into tribes was used for conducting the census and levying the army. The most important act of Servius Tullius was the construction of a new defensive wall around Rome, known as the Servian Wall. This wall enclosed a significantly larger area than previous fortifications and was a powerful defensive structure. It served as Rome's defense for several centuries until the construction of the Aurelian walls in the 3rd century AD. Archaeological remains of this wall, although most of them date to a later time, the 4th century BC, after the Gallic invasion, can still be seen in Rome. Servius Tullius also paid attention to religion. He built a temple to Diana on the Aventine Hill. This temple was intended to be a common sanctuary for all Latin cities, which would emphasize Rome's leading role in the Latin League. He also promoted the cult of Fortuna, the goddess of luck, to whom he, according to tradition, owed much himself. In foreign policy, Servius Tullius sought to maintain peaceful relations with his neighbors, especially the Latins and Etruscans, preferring diplomacy to military action. He concluded an alliance with the Latin cities that acknowledged Rome's hegemony. Legend says that Servius Tullius was popular with the people, especially among the plebeians, whose position he somewhat improved with his reforms, for example, abolishing debt slavery for those who could not repay debts, although this claim is disputed and possibly refers to later laws. However, his reforms and his origin caused discontent among some of the old patrician aristocracy, who saw him as a usurper and destroyer of ancient ways. The sons, or according to another version, grandsons, of Tarquinius Priscus, Lucius Tarquinius, later nicknamed the Proud Superbus, and Aruns Tarquinius, were particularly hostile to him. Servius Tullius, trying to reconcile with them and strengthen his position, married his two daughters, both named Tullia, to them. The elder Tullia, who was gentler and more virtuous, was married to the ambitious and cruel Lucius. The younger Tullia, on the contrary, was an ambitious and ruthless schemer, and she married the milder Aruns. This arrangement led to tragedy. The younger Tullia and Lucius Tarquinius, united by a common thirst for power and contempt for their spouses, conspired. They eliminated their unsuitable partners. Aruns and the elder Tullia died under mysterious circumstances, possibly poisoned, and married each other. Now they had a common goal: to overthrow Servius Tullius and seize power. Lucius Tarquinius began to openly oppose the aging king, accusing him of illegally seizing power, of currying favor with the plebeians, and of violating the rights of the patricians. He gathered discontented aristocrats around him, bribed supporters, and prepared for a coup. Servius Tullius, despite his age, tried to resist him, relying on the support of the people, but the forces were unequal. On a fateful day, Lucius Tarquinius, accompanied by armed supporters, burst into the Senate, occupied the royal seat, and delivered an accusatory speech against Servius. When Servius Tullius, summoned from the palace, arrived in the curia and attempted to object, Lucius seized him and threw him down the steps of the Senate building onto the stones of the forum. The old king, still alive but severely wounded, was finished off in the street by assassins sent by Lucius, and then an episode occurred that entered Roman history as a symbol of extreme cruelty and lawlessness. Tullia, Servius's daughter and Lucius Tarquinius's wife, hurried to the forum to be the first to greet her husband as the new king. Her chariot was passing down the street where her father's bloody corpse lay. The charioteer stopped the horses in horror, but Tullia, impatient, ordered him to drive straight over the body. The chariot, splattered with the blood of the murdered king, drove on, and the street has since been called Vicus Sceleratus, Crime Street. Thus tragically ended the reign of Servius Tullius, one of Rome's most outstanding and reform-minded kings. His reforms outlived him and became the basis for the future development of the Roman state. But his violent death and the accession of Lucius Tarquinius the Proud opened the last, darkest page in the history of regal Rome, a page that inevitably led to revolution and the establishment of the Republic. The murder of Servius Tullius was not just a change of ruler. It was an act of blatant lawlessness, a violation of all norms and traditions, and it could not remain without consequence. The murder of Servius Tullius, committed with such cynical cruelty, and especially the monstrous act of his daughter Tullia, driving her chariot over her own father's body, plunged Rome into a state of shock and numbness. Lucius Tarquinius ascended the throne, and he would very soon earn his nickname, the Proud Superbus. His reign, approximately 535 to 509 BC, was the seventh and last in Rome's regal history, and it proved to be the complete opposite of his predecessor's reign, turning into a true tyranny, which ultimately led to the fall of the monarchy. Lucius Tarquinius the Proud seized power by force, without waiting for election by the people or approval by the Senate. From the very beginning, he made it clear that he would not be bound by any laws or traditions. He surrounded himself with armed bodyguards, which was unthinkable for previous kings, with the possible exception of Romulus in the last years of his reign. He ruled as an absolute despot, relying on fear and violence. The first thing Tarquinius the Proud did was unleash repression against the supporters of Servius Tullius. Many senators, especially those who dared to express dissent or simply seemed suspicious to him, he executed or exiled and confiscated their property. The Senate was intimidated and virtually stripped of its influence. Tarquinius stopped convening it, or convened it only to announce his decisions. He abolished many of Servius Tullius's laws aimed at supporting the plebeians and reinstated debt slavery in its harshest forms. The people groaned under the burden of taxes and forced labor. Tarquinius the Proud used the population of Rome to carry out his ambitious building projects. He continued and completed the construction of the Capitoline Temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, which had been started by his grandfather or father, according to different versions, Tarquinius Priscus. This temple became the largest and most magnificent in Rome, a symbol of its power. Legend has it that when digging the foundation pit, a human head, caput, was found, untouched by decay, which was interpreted as an omen that this place would become the head, caput mundi, of the world. Hence the name of the hill, Capitoline. Tarquinius also completed the Cloaca Maxima, finally draining the marshy low ground for the Forum. He built new stands in the Circus Maximus, increasing its capacity. These constructions undoubtedly adorned the city and contributed to its development, but they were carried out at the cost of the unbearable labor and suffering of the common people, who were forced to work on them without pay, like slaves. In foreign policy, Tarquinius the Proud was aggressive and successful. He waged numerous wars with his neighbors, the Volsci, Sabines, and Latins. He subdued many Latin cities, forcing them to acknowledge Rome's hegemony and join the Latin League under his leadership. He founded Roman colonies at Signia and Circe, strengthening Roman influence in the region. Tarquinius the Proud also captured the city of Gabii by cunning. Unable to take it by force, he sent his younger son Sextus Tarquinius there. Sextus appeared in Gabii as an exile, supposedly fleeing his cruel father's tyranny. The Gabians believed him and received him with honor. Sextus gradually gained their trust, became one of their commanders, and began secretly eliminating the most influential and noble citizens of Gabii, acting on his father's instructions. When all opposition was liquidated, Sextus easily delivered the city to Rome's control. This episode with the poppies, Tarquinius, not wanting to give his son direct instructions through a messenger, simply knocked off the heads of the tallest poppies in the garden, and Sextus understood the hint, became a classic example of treachery and tyrannical methods of rule. Despite military successes and building achievements, hatred for Tarquinius the Proud and his family grew in Rome. His sons, Titus, Aruns, and especially Sextus, were just as arrogant, cruel, and dissolute as their father. They acted like masters of the world, disregarding everyone and everything. The patience of the Romans was gradually wearing thin. Legend connects the overthrow of Tarquinius with another famous omen. One day, a snake crawled out of a palace column, which greatly frightened the king. He decided to send envoys to the oracle at Delphi in Greece to learn the meaning of this omen. Among the envoys were his sons Titus and Aruns, and also his nephew Lucius Junius Brutus. Brutus, to avoid the fate of many noble Romans killed by Tarquinius, pretended to be simple-minded. Brutus in Latin means dull, fool. The king's son scoffed at him but took him along as a jester. At Delphi, after the oracle gave its answer to the king's question, the answer was vague and foretold the fall of his power. The sons of Tarquinius asked which of them would inherit the kingdom. The oracle replied, "He who first kisses his mother." Titus and Aruns rushed to kiss their mother upon their return to Rome, but Brutus, pretending to stumble, fell to the ground and kissed it, saying that the earth is the common mother of all people. Thus, he cleverly fulfilled the prophecy. The catalyst that finally overflowed the cup of popular anger was the famous rape of Lucretia. This story is one of the key myths in the Roman foundation of the Republic. During the siege of the city of Ardea by Tarquinius's army, the king's sons and their noble companions, among whom was Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, the king's relative and Lucretia's husband, argued about the virtues of their wives. They decided to immediately ride to Rome and check what their wives were doing in their absence. The king's daughters-in-law were caught at a feast, in idleness and revelry. But Lucretia, Collatinus's wife, was sitting at home late in the evening, spinning wool with her maidservants. Her modesty and virtue made a deep impression on everyone, especially on Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son. He was consumed by passion for her, and a few days later, secretly returned to Collatinus's house in Collatia. Lucretia received him as a guest and her husband's relative. At night, Sextus, threatening her with a weapon, forced her to have relations with him. To break her resistance, he threatened to kill her and place the corpse of a slave next to her, announcing that he had found her in adultery. Lucretia, fearing not so much death as dishonor, yielded to the violence. The next day, after Sextus had left, Lucretia sent for her father, Spurius Lucretius Tricipitinus, and her husband Collatinus. They arrived accompanied by their friends, Publius Valerius Publicola and Lucius Junius Brutus, the same simple-minded one. Lucretia, in tears, told them what had happened, and having made them swear to avenge her violated honor, plunged a knife into her heart. Her suicide was the final straw. Brutus, who until then had pretended to be a fool, was suddenly transformed. He pulled the knife from Lucretia's wound, and raising it, swore to expel the Tarquins from Rome, and never again allow royal power in the city. Collatinus, Lucretius, and Valerius followed his example. They carried Lucretia's body to the Forum in Collatia, and then to Rome, telling the people about Sextus's crime and calling for rebellion. The Romans, outraged to the core by this crime and tired of the Tarquins' tyranny, rose as one. The popular assembly, convened by Brutus, decreed the exile of King Lucius Tarquinius the Proud with all his family, and deprived him of royal power. The gates of Rome were closed to him. Tarquinius the Proud himself was with his army near Ardea at the time. Upon hearing of the rebellion, he rushed to Rome, but it was already too late. The city would not receive him. The army, learning of the events in Rome and the decision of the popular assembly, also sided with the rebels. Tarquinius the Proud, with his sons Titus and Aruns, was forced to flee and seek refuge in Etruria, in the city of Cumae. Sextus Tarquinius fled to Gabii, where, remembering his past misdeeds, the local inhabitants killed him. Thus, in 509 BC, according to traditional dating, the almost 250-year rule of kings in Rome ended. The tyranny of the last Tarquin and the noble impulse caused by Lucretia's tragedy led to the birth of the Roman Republic. This was not just the overthrow of one ruler. It was a change of an entire political system. Rome was entering a new republican era of its history, an era that would be full of both great achievements and fierce internal struggles, but which would ultimately lead Rome to dominance over the entire Mediterranean. The myth of Lucretia, Brutus, and the expulsion of the kings became a cornerstone of Roman republican ideology, a symbol of the struggle for freedom against tyranny. The expulsion of Tarquinius the Proud and his family in 509 BC was not just another palace coup, but a true revolution that ended the regal era and opened a new page in the history of Rome, the Republican one. This transition was not easy and far from peaceful, but it laid the foundations of the political system that would last for almost 5 centuries and lead Rome to unprecedented power. Having overthrown the last king, the Romans faced the necessity of creating a new form of government. They were determined never again to allow the concentration of power in the hands of one person. The idea of a king, rex, became so odious to them that the very word acquired an extremely negative connotation. The main architects of the new order were the heroes of the recent rebellion, Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, Lucretia's husband. It was they who, at Brutus's suggestion, were elected as the first consuls, the highest officials of the new republic. Consular power was a kind of modified royal power, but with significant limitations. Firstly, there were 2 consuls, and they had equal rights, including the right of veto, intercessio, over each other's decisions. This prevented usurpation of power by one of them. Secondly, the consuls were elected for a strictly limited term, 1 year. After this term, they became private citizens and could be held accountable for their actions during their tenure. Thirdly, their power was not hereditary. These principles, collegiality, limited term, and election, became fundamental for all republican magistracies. The consuls inherited supreme military, imperium, and civil authority from the kings. They commanded the army, convened the Senate and popular assemblies, and administered justice. The symbols of their authority also resembled those of kings. The curule chair, the toga praetexta, 12 lictors with fasces. However, within the city of Rome, the axes were removed from the fasces, symbolizing that the power of life and death over citizens belonged to the popular assembly. The Senate, which had been humiliated and practically dissolved under Tarquinius the Proud, regained its significance. Brutus increased its membership to 300, including representatives of noble plebeian families, the so-called junior fathers, patres conscripti. The Senate became the main advisory body for the consuls. Its authority and influence were immense, although formally its decrees, senatus consulta, were recommendatory. The popular assemblies, especially the centuriate comitia, also played an important role. They elected consuls and other magistrates, passed laws, and decided matters of war and peace. However, the new republic faced serious challenges from the outset. The exiled Tarquinius the Proud had no intention of giving up. He found support among the Etruscan cities, especially from the powerful king Lars Porsena of Clusium. Tarquinius convinced Porsena to help him regain the Roman throne, portraying his exile as a dangerous precedent for all monarchs. A difficult war began between Rome and the Etruscans. Porsena's army approached the very walls of Rome and besieged the city. During this war, the Romans performed miracles of heroism that entered the annals of history and became examples to be emulated. One of the most famous legends of this period is the feat of Horatius Cocles, when the Etruscans breached the Pons Sublicius, the only bridge over the Tiber. Horatius, along with 2 comrades, Spurius Lardius and Titus Herminius, held it against an entire army of enemies, while the Romans destroyed the bridge behind them. When the bridge was about to collapse, Horatius ordered his comrades to retreat, but he himself continued to fight until the bridge fell. Then he, wounded and in his armor, threw himself into the Tiber and swam to the other side, to his own people. For this feat, A statue was erected in his honor in the Forum, and he was given as much land as he could plow in one day. Another legend tells of Gaius Mucius Scaevola, the lefty. He infiltrated Porsena's camp with the intention of killing him. However, by mistake, he killed not the king, but his scribe, who was dressed in similar rich attire. When seized, Mucius, to demonstrate his resolve and contempt for death, placed his right hand in the fire on an altar and held it there until it was charred. Impressed by his courage, Porsena released him. Mucius then told the king that there were 300 more men like him in Rome, ready to kill him. This news so frightened Porsena that, according to one version, he lifted the siege and made peace with Rome. According to another, more plausible version, Porsena did capture Rome, or at least forced it to submit for a time, but was then forced to withdraw. Another heroine of this war is Cloelia, one of the Roman maidens given to Porsena as a hostage. She, along with a group of other maidens, escaped from the Etruscan camp, swimming across the Tiber under a shower of enemy arrows. Porsena demanded her return, but admiring her bravery, allowed her to take some of the hostages of her choice with her. Cloelia chose the youngest boys, as they were the most vulnerable. An equestrian statue was also erected in her honor on the Sacred Way. These legends, regardless of their historical accuracy, reflected the spirit of the time, the Romans' readiness for self-sacrifice in the name of their republic's freedom and independence. They shaped national identity and fostered patriotism and civic virtue. In addition to the external threat, the young republic also faced internal problems. In Rome itself, there was a party of Tarquin's supporters, mostly from the noble youth who were dissatisfied with the strictness of the new order. They organized a conspiracy to bring the king back. Even the sons of Brutus himself, Titus and Tiberius, were involved in this plot. When the conspiracy was discovered, Brutus, as consul, had to judge his own sons. And he, placing duty to the state above paternal feelings, sentenced them to death. The execution was carried out before his eyes. This act of stern justice, though tragic, strengthened the Republic's authority and showed that the law was the same for everyone. Brutus himself soon died in battle. During a battle with the Etruscans, he met Aaron's Tarquinius, the son of the exiled king, in single combat. They both inflicted mortal wounds upon each other and fell dead. The Roman matrons mourned Brutus as a father for a whole year. His co-consul, Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, however, was soon forced to resign his office and leave Rome. The reason was his name, Tarquinius, which reminded the people of the hated kings. The people did not trust him, despite all his services. His place was taken by Publius Valerius, who was nicknamed Publicola, friend of the people. Valerius Publicola passed a number of laws aimed at strengthening the Republic and protecting the rights of citizens. He confirmed the right of appeal to the popular assembly against a death sentence pronounced by a magistrate, Lex Valeria de Provocatione. He also established that the treasury, aerarium, should be kept in the Temple of Saturn under the control of the Senate, not the consuls. He even ordered his luxurious house on the Velian Hill, which seemed too high to the people and resembled a fortress, to be torn down and built a new one at the foot of the hill. These measures strengthened his popularity and the trust in republican institutions. The last attempt by Tarquinius the Proud to regain power occurred in 496 BC at Lake Regillus. He secured the support of the Latin League, which feared Rome's growing power. The battle was long and bloody. According to tradition, at a critical moment, the divine twins, the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, appeared on white horses and fought on the side of the Romans. The Romans won a decisive victory. Tarquinius the Proud finally lost all hope of return and died in exile in Cumae. With his death, the threat of monarchical restoration passed. The Roman Republic endured the difficult struggle. However, victory over external enemies did not mean the end of problems. Within Roman society itself, a serious conflict was brewing between the patricians, the hereditary aristocracy, who monopolized all the highest offices and owned most of the land, and the plebeians, the common people, who bore the main burden of wars and taxes, but were practically deprived of political rights. This struggle between the classes would become the main content of Rome's internal history for the next 2 centuries. Thus, the transition from myth to history, from legendary kings to republican magistrates, was a complex and multifaceted process. The myths about Romulus and Remus, about the 7 kings, about the rape of the Sabine women, about the Horatii and Curiatii, about Lucretia and Brutus, all of them played an enormous role in shaping Roman identity, Roman values, Roman character. They explained the origin of the city, its institutions, its customs. They provided examples of valor, piety, patriotism, but also of tyranny, betrayal, and lawlessness. The historical reality of early Rome was, of course, more complex and perhaps more prosaic than these vivid legends. But without these myths, it is impossible to understand the spirit of ancient Rome, its aspirations, and its achievements. The era of the 7 kings, which began with divine intervention and wolf's milk, ended with human heroism and an oath over Lucretia's body. Rome embarked on a new path, the path of the Republic, but the shadow of its legendary founders and rulers would long hover over the 7 hills, reminding of how it all began. And each new turn of history would somehow refer back to these ancient traditions, drawing inspiration or warning from them. The early Republic, having barely repulsed the Tarquins and their allies, immediately plunged into a new abyss, the internal struggle between the patricians and the plebeians. This conflict, which lasted for almost 2 centuries, was no less dramatic and fateful than the wars with external enemies. Essentially, it was a struggle for the soul of Rome, for what its future society would be. An oligarchy, ruled by a narrow caste of the elect, or more democratic, where all citizens had rights and opportunities. The patricians, descendants of the senator fathers, supposedly elected by Romulus, considered themselves the salt of the Roman earth. They owned large land holdings. Ager publicus, public land, was distributed mostly among them, held all priestly offices, which were closely connected with politics and law, as the pontiff priests interpreted laws and kept the calendar, and, most importantly, only they could be elected to the highest state offices, especially as consuls. The plebeians, from plebs, people, crowd, on the other hand, constituted the majority of the population. These were small landowners, craftsmen, merchants, laborers. They bore the main burden of military service, paid taxes, but were practically excluded from governing the state. Their interests were not represented by anyone. Their economic situation was particularly difficult. Frequent wars ruined small farms. The plebeians were forced to borrow from wealthy patricians at exorbitant interest rates. If a debt was not repaid on time, the debtor could lose not only their property, but also their freedom. They could be sold into slavery, nexum, debt bondage. This caused enormous social tension. The first major clash occurred as early as 494 BC, the so-called First Secession, withdrawal, of the plebeians. Driven to despair by debts and oppression from the patricians, The plebeians, who formed the backbone of the army, refused to fight in the midst of a war with the Volsci and Aequi and left Rome for the Sacred Mount, according to another version, the Aventine. They declared that they would not return until their demands were met. This was essentially a rebellion that brought Rome to the brink of disaster. The patricians found themselves in a very difficult position. Without the plebeian militia, the city was defenseless. Negotiations began. Legend attributes a decisive role in the reconciliation to the former consul, Agrippa Menenius Lenatus. He told the plebeians the famous parable of the members of the human body who rebelled against the stomach, accusing it of doing nothing but consuming the food they brought to it. In the end, when they stopped feeding the stomach, the whole body weakened and was on the verge of death. Similarly, said Menenius, in a state, all parts must work together, and each is important in its place. This parable, as well as the promise of some concessions, persuaded the plebeians to return to Rome. The main outcome of the first secession was the establishment of a new magistracy, the tribunes of the plebs, tribuni plebis. Initially, there were 2. Later, the number grew to 5, and then to 10. The tribunes of the plebs were elected only from the plebeians at plebeian assemblies, concilia plebis, and possessed sacred inviolability, sacrosanctitas. Anyone who harmed their person was declared an outlaw. Their main function was to protect the rights of the plebeians from the arbitrary actions of patrician magistrates. They were granted the right of veto, ius intercessionis, over decrees of the Senate and orders of the consuls if these encroached upon the interests of the plebs. They could convene plebeian assemblies and propose bills, plebiscites to them. The emergence of the tribunes of the plebs was a great victory for the plebeians. This was the first step towards limiting the absolute power of the patriciate and creating a more balanced political system. However, the struggle did not end there. The plebeians demanded further concessions, primarily the codification of laws. Until then, the laws were unwritten. Their interpretation was in the hands of the patrician pontiff priests, which allowed for arbitrary actions. After a long struggle, the patricians were forced to yield. In 451 BC, a commission of 10 men was elected, the decemvirs, decemviri legibus scribundis, 10 men for writing laws, to whom full state power was transferred for a year to compile a code of laws. The consuls and tribunes of the plebs resigned their offices for this period. The first college of decemvirs, consisting only of patricians, composed 10 tables of laws. But since the work was not completed, a second college was elected the following year, which, according to some sources, included plebeians. This second college added 2 more tables, and thus appeared the famous Laws of the 12 Tables, Leges Duodecim Tabularum. These laws were engraved on bronze tablets and displayed in the forum for public viewing. The Laws of the 12 Tables became the basis of Roman law for many centuries. They codified norms of private and public law, regulated family relations, property issues, debt obligations, and judicial procedure. Although they were quite harsh, for example, they retained debt bondage, provided for severe punishments, their significance was enormous. They established equality of all citizens before the law, at least formally, limited the arbitrary actions of judges, and made the law more accessible and understandable. However, the second college of decemvirs, led by Appius Claudius, refused to resign their powers after the year had passed, and attempted to establish a tyrannical rule. The decemvirs acted like despots, ignoring the Senate and the people. The final straw was another tragic episode, very reminiscent of the story of Lucretia. Appius Claudius became infatuated with a young plebeian girl, Virginia, the daughter of Centurion Lucius Virginius and the fiancée of former tribune of the plebs Lucius Acilius. To get her, Appius Claudius bribed his client to declare Virginia a runaway slave. When the case was heard in court, Appius Claudius himself, as the presiding judge, ruled in favor of his client. The girl's father, Lucius Virginius, seeing that he could not save his daughter from dishonor, snatched a knife from a butcher in the forum and in front of everyone stabbed her, exclaiming, "Only thus can I preserve your freedom and honor." This act caused widespread outrage. The plebeians again withdrew from Rome to the Sacred Mount, the Second Secession. The decemvirs were overthrown, and Appius Claudius committed suicide in prison. The power of the consuls and tribunes of the plebs was restored. The laws of the 12 tables, however, were affirmed and became the basis of the legal system. The struggle continued. The plebeians sought the abolition of the ban on marriages between patricians and plebeians. This ban was enshrined in the 12 tables but was soon repealed by the Lex Canuleia in 445 BC. Access to the highest magistracies, especially the consulship, and resolution of the agrarian issue, redistribution of public land. Gradually, step by step, the plebeians won new rights. In 444 BC, the office of military tribunes with consular power was introduced, to which plebeians could also be elected, although the patricians long sabotaged their election. In 367 BC, the Licinian Sextian laws were passed, which became a major milestone in the class struggle. These laws stipulated: 1. One of the consuls must be elected from the plebeians. 2. The maximum size of landholding from public land, ager publicus, by a single citizen was limited. 3. The condition of debtors was eased. Part of the paid interest was counted towards the principal debt, and the remaining amount was paid in installments. The passage of these laws was a huge victory for the plebeians. Although the patricians long tried to maintain their privileges, the path to full equality was open. In the following decades, the plebeians also gained access to other magistracies: dictator, 356 BC, censor, 351 BC, praetor, 337 BC. In 300 BC, the Lex Ogulnia opened the priestly colleges of pontiffs and augurs to plebeians. The final act in the class struggle is considered the Lex Hortensia of 287 BC, which decreed that the decisions of the plebeian assemblies, plebiscites, had the force of law for all citizens, including patricians, and did not require Senate approval. By this time, the old division into patricians and plebeians had largely lost its significance. The old hereditary aristocracy was replaced by a new nobility, nobilitas, consisting of the upper echelon of both patrician and wealthy plebeian families, whose representatives held the highest state offices. Roman society became more consolidated, which allowed it to successfully withstand external threats and begin expansion in Italy. Thus, the era of the Seven Kings, which began with the legendary Romulus and ended with the tyranny of Tarquinius the Proud, was not just a prologue to the Republic. It laid the foundations of Roman statehood, military affairs, religion, and law. The myths and legends of this period, intertwined with historical realities, created the foundation upon which the edifice of the Roman Republic, and later the Empire, was built. The struggle with neighbors, the formation of the first institutions, the actions of mysterious kings, all of this was part of the complex process of the formation of a city destined to conquer the world. And even when royal power was overthrown, the legacy of the regal period continued to live on in customs, laws, beliefs, and most importantly, in the very spirit of the Roman people, who always remembered their harsh but glorious origins. The transition from monarchy to republic, and then the internal struggle for equality, showed Rome's amazing ability to transform, to adapt, to create complex and effective political and social mechanisms. And this ability, forged in the crucible of myths and real historical challenges, became one of the main reasons for its future greatness. The journey from the mythical origins of Rome, shrouded in legends of the she-wolf and divine ancestors, to the establishment of the Republic, forged in the fire of struggle against tyranny and internal strife, is the story not just of a city, but of an entire civilization in its infancy. The 7 kings, from Romulus to Tarquinius the Proud, each in their own way, contributed to the formation of what we today call ancient Rome. Their rule, which according to tradition lasted 2.5 centuries, was a time of laying the fundamental foundations of Roman society, state, and culture. Romulus, the legendary founder, son of Mars, and nurtured by a she-wolf, gave the city its name, its first citizens, even if gathered haphazardly, and its first military and political structures, such as the Senate and the division into curiae. His figure, though mythical, symbolized the primordial energy, warlikeness, and divine favor that the Romans always considered inherent to their city. The story of the rape of the Sabine women, however cruel it may seem, reflected the pragmatism and willingness of the Romans to resort to extreme measures for the survival and growth of their polis, and the subsequent reconciliation and merging of the two peoples demonstrated Rome's unique ability to assimilate and integrate outsiders, which would be one of the keys to its future imperial power. Numa Pompilius, a Sabine who succeeded the warlike Romulus, became the embodiment of peace, piety, and legality. He is credited with creating the foundations of Roman religion, establishing priestly colleges, pontiffs, flamines, salii, fetial, vestals, reforming the calendar, and building temples. He taught the Romans not only how to fight, but also how to honor the gods, observe rituals, and live by law. His reign became a symbol of a golden age of peace and justice, contrasting with Romulus's turbulent era and the subsequent warlike kings. Tullus Hostilius led Rome back onto the path of war. His name is associated with the destruction of Alba Longa, Rome's mother city, and the relocation of its inhabitants to Rome. This act, though cruel, demonstrated Rome's growing ambition and its drive for hegemony in Latium. The legend of the combat between the Horatii and the Curiatii became a classic example of Roman patriotism, a readiness for self-sacrifice for the homeland, where duty to the state was placed above personal feelings and kinship ties. Ancus Marcius, Numa's grandson, attempted to find a balance between Tullus's warlikeness and his grandfather's peacefulness. He successfully waged war against the Latins, expanding Roman territory, but also paid attention to the city's internal development. He is credited with founding Ostia, Rome's seaport, building the first bridge over the Tiber, Pons Sublicius, fortifying the Janiculum Hill, and building the first prison. He continued the policy of integrating conquered peoples, resettling them in Rome, and granting them citizenship. With the rise of the Etruscan Tarquin dynasty, Rome entered a new phase of its development. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the Elder, a wealthy and ambitious Etruscan, brought to Rome a more developed culture, technologies, and elaborate royal rituals. Under him, large-scale construction began: the Capitoline Temple, the Circus Maximus, the Cloaca Maxima. The city transformed, acquiring the characteristics of a real metropolitan center. He increased the size of the Senate, strengthened the army, and expanded Roman influence in the region. Servius Tullius, Tarquinius Priscus's son-in-law, whose origin is shrouded in mystery, entered history as a great reformer. His centuriate reform, based on a property census, fundamentally changed Rome's social and military structure. It created a new basis for levying the army and forming popular assemblies, centuriate comitia, thus laying the foundations for the future republican system. He is also credited with expanding the city boundaries, dividing the city into tribes, and building the famous Servian Wall. His reign was aimed at ordering and consolidating the state. Finally, Lucius Tarquinius the Proud, the last of the 7 kings, became a symbol of tyranny and arbitrariness. His cruel rule, disregard for laws and the Senate, repression against the nobility, and oppression of the people led to widespread hatred. The rape of the virtuous Lucretia by his son Sextus was the last straw that overflowed the cup of patience. The rebellion, led by Lucius Junius Brutus, led to the expulsion of the Tarquins and the establishment of the Republic in 509 BC. This transition from myth to history, from royal power to republican rule, was not easy. It is difficult to separate the grain of historical truth from the chaff of legends and myths that shroud the early history of Rome. Archaeological data confirms the existence of a large settlement on the site of Rome during the regal period, the presence of Etruscan influence, and traces of large-scale construction works. But the details of the king's biographies and many deeds attributed to them are likely products of a later literary and historical tradition that sought to explain and heroicize the origins of the Roman state. However, for the Romans themselves, these myths and legends were not just fairy tales. They shaped their national consciousness, their value system, their understanding of what was right and wrong. The figures of Romulus, Numa, Brutus, Lucretia, and the Hieraci served as examples to be emulated or warnings. They were part of the Roman myth, the idea of Rome's divine election, its special mission, and the valor and piety of its ancestors. The establishment of the Republic did not mean an immediate arrival of peace and prosperity. The young state had to endure a difficult struggle against the exiled Tarquins and their allies, and then enter into a long and exhausting conflict between the patricians and the plebeians for equality. But it was in this struggle that the character of the Roman people was forged, along with their political institutions and their legal system. The laws of the 12 tables, the establishment of the tribunes of the plebs, the Licinian Sextian laws, the Lex Hortensia, all these were milestones on the path to creating a more just and balanced society. Myth and history in Rome were inextricably linked. Myth provided the ideological basis for historical processes, and history, in turn, drew images and symbols from myth. And even when Rome became a powerful republic, and then an empire, it never forgot its humble, almost mythical origins: the shepherds on the Palatine, the she-wolf who suckled its founders, the 7 kings who laid its foundation. This memory was a source of its strength and its confidence in its destiny. Studying the beginning of Rome, we see how order is born from chaos, how a single people is formed from the clash of various tribes and cultures, how a complex religious system grows from primitive beliefs, and how a coherent code of laws develops from customary law. It is a story of how a small town on the banks of the Tiber, thanks to perseverance, discipline, military valor, and an extraordinary ability to adapt and integrate, was able to transform itself first into the master of Italy, and then of the entire Mediterranean. And although the era of the kings ended, its legacy continued to live on, shaping Rome's path for many centuries to come.